Welcome. I'm Karen Field Bullock, and this is lesson number 3 in my course, A Spiritual Path to True Love. Today's lesson is part of a segment on love and love's opposites. In the last lesson, I defined love, love's polar opposite, love's existential opposite, and one of love's spiritual opposites, chronic fearfulness. Today, I want to discuss two other, and in my opinion, equally important spiritual opposites of love. That would be cynicism and grief. But let me begin by explaining why I call these states spiritual opposites of love. In other words, why not psychological opposites, or emotional opposites, or attitudinal opposites? So if you check the dictionary, the word spiritual is defined as intangible or immaterial, and also spirited. While you may think of spiritual things as otherworldly, spirit is very much a part of our daily life, too. If you think back to your school days, where you learned about school spirit and team spirit, being spirited involves the spirit of enthusiasm, optimism, healthy confidence, and determination or will to succeed. In general, being spirited also involves faith, or the belief that things work out for the best, that in the end, the greater good prevails. Further, spirit involves positive connectedness, a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood, fraternity, as the French say. It's a sense of unity, whether it's feeling connected to your teammates, or your school, your company, your community, your country, all of humanity, or all forms of life. Being spirited doesn't mean that you're blind to what's bad and what can go wrong. It just means you maintain a positive, hopeful outlook and continue to believe that the greater good, some call it God, will ultimately prevail. Patriotism, especially in the face of war, is a good example of being spirited, believing that your country will, in the end, prevail, not because of might alone, as logic would dictate, but because you believe your country represents what's right, and that your forces are the good guys. There's no logical leap here from that type of patriotism to belief in some overriding force for good in the universe, which some call God. Think about it. The assertion that a certain country or alliance shall prevail in war because they represent the greater good is entirely mystical, not logical. Even renowned, outspoken atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, each of whom wrote books trashing religion and promoting atheism, exhibited in their books a spirit of optimism about how much better they imagined our world would be if only all the religions of the world were abandoned. This idea is based on wholly unsupported, unproven assumptions that if everyone relied on logic and reason alone, we would somehow have a better world than the one we have. Really? How would that work? Would sociopaths suddenly become balanced and loving people because someone taught them how to think logically? Wait a minute. Isn't it true that sociopaths can be quite bright intellectually? Or would the dark side of human nature suddenly brighten up with logic leading the way? Would people around the world, or even in your region, suddenly all agree on what is good and what is bad? And how would people with less general intelligence or less confidence in their ability to think logically suddenly become confidently smarter, using the logic they have trouble with? Would people racked with guilt or hopelessness find solace, contentment, or a reason to live by reading a math book, perhaps? Or by learning some school of thought in psychology? In a future lesson, I'll address those anti-religious books directly. But for now, let me point out that whether you're religious, non-religious, or anti-religious, you're still happier when you're spirited. Of course, the opposite of being spirited is to be dispirited, a state that can afflict believers and non-believers alike. When you're dispirited, you feel more or less deflated, pessimistic, and possibly depressed. After whatever harsh experience deflated your enthusiasm and positivity, you probably tried to regain your spirit, often with friends or family cheering you up. But if that doesn't work, you might either find fault within yourself and become fearful, or look outward to find fault with whoever did you wrong and become cynical about them or their type. Some people do both. So now let's look at cynicism. Cynicism is an attitude based on the perception that badness or evil most definitely prevails in the world or in a certain area of life. You could be a cynic about politics, religions, money, schools, grown-ups, the younger generation, rural people, urban people, suburban people, or people in the next town over from yours. And yet you could still believe wholeheartedly in true love. However, if you're cynical about love itself, or about the kind of person you're attracted to, or about the fundamental goodness of human nature, then your cynicism will be a direct spiritual opposite to love. That's because anytime you're faced with great goodness in a person you're attracted to, that experience will not fit on your inner reality map. You'll discount it as foolish, a trick, a sick joke, or just an illusion. In fact, people who are highly cynical in life often don't believe in love at all. They think love is something like the story of the emperor's new clothes, just a myth that society agrees upon, but that only fools take to heart. Cynics in love treat any love relationship as a game and use a business mentality to try to win the game. They figure if there's mutual back scratching, negotiations, and power leveraging, that's what's real. Love? Bah humbug. Cynics universally believe they know better than anyone else the nature of reality. And whenever things go wrong for them, they console themselves and boost their egos by reminding themselves that they called it first. They knew it. They view themselves as wise, and they see non-cynics as fools. Yet, cynicism in love produces a self-fulfilling prophecy. People who are cynical about human nature or about love itself can never achieve a vision of goodness that they don't believe is real. On the positive side, cynics in love avoid ever feeling fooled again because somewhere in their past they were burned very badly and were unable to bounce back. Cynics assure themselves of their superior understanding of the world and firmly believe that any fault lies outside themselves, which makes them feel very stable and appear confident. People who are chronically fearful where love is concerned will endure emotional instability, cycling between hopes and fears, and they'll risk being fooled and failing again because they want to retain at least some hope of finding love. But cynics in love don't want to take that risk because they just don't ever want to be fooled again. What does cynicism sound like? Maybe you cynically decide that selfishness and greed are at the very core of human nature, and therefore, whoever you're attracted to must be basically selfish and greedy too. Or you might think you're just the victim of bad luck. You might think women are inferior and that love is just a myth cooked up by women to trick men into marriage. Or you might think men are inferior and that they're incapable of love. Or you might think that in this world, the bad prevail and the good die young. So to get ahead, you have to be a jerk, a bully, a sneak, or even a criminal. These different cynical attitudes represent the opposite of being spirited. Now, if you're like me, throughout your life, you've held all different attitudes. You've been confident and open to goodness in some area of life and in some people, sometimes naively and foolishly so. You've been deeply hurt and disillusioned, while in some areas you've bounced back to feel optimistic and spirited again. In other areas, you've become chronically fearful, and in still other areas, you've turned cynical. Okay, let's say you had a bad relationship breakup and you couldn't get over it completely. If you tend to be self critical, you might become fearful that there's something about you that makes you a failure in love. Or maybe you don't really blame yourself, but instead you believe the curse that if you're lucky with money, you are doomed to be unlucky in love. When that curse seems to be proven true in your life, you may identify it as part of who you are, making you a little bit fearful that the problem is you, and a little bit cynical that the problem is the curse, something outside of you. Or if you tend to feel highly self confident, you might become cynical about love itself, or relationships, or the opposite sex, or the kind of people you're attracted to because you think the problem can't possibly be you. So, just to reiterate, not all varieties of cynicism oppose love. You could be cynical about the social justice system, about the politics of toxins in your environment, or about any other extraneous issues, and still have a chance at love. It's only cynicism about the existence of love itself, or about the underlying goodness of people, or the type of people you're attracted to, that will directly oppose your capacity to experience true love. Both chronic fearfulness and certain types of cynicism are spiritual opposites of love because they're attitudes people develop after a serious loss if they can't fully recover their spirit. In addition, these attitudes are used to guard against the pain of a future breakup. Let's say that despite your cynicism or fearfulness, you meet someone new and open yourself up to the possibility that this person could be the one. Your attitude flips and you become optimistic and spirited. Eventually, though, the new relationship turns challenging, and not understanding how to grow through it, you decide that your new partner doesn't love you after all. At that point, you can pull out your old attitudes to console yourself. The old cynical voice in your head may come alive and say, "See, I knew it." While the fearful voice lurking within might pop up and say, "Darn it, that's just what I was afraid of." Pulling out those old attitudes seems to make it a little easier when a new relationship starts to fail. Falling back to cynicism or chronic fearfulness is a way to try to buffer yourself from the impact of grief. So now let's talk about grief. I define grief as the natural human reaction to the loss of someone or something you've perceived as profoundly good or profoundly good for you, someone or something you love. The more profoundly good, the deeper your grief. Grief isn't a simple, straightforward reaction to that loss, though. It's a multi-stage process. In 1969, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a landmark book called On Death and Dying. Late in her career, she co-wrote a book called On Grief and Grieving. That book applied the 5 stages of death and dying to the way people grieve when someone else dies or after any major loss, such as losing your marriage or partnership. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. After a serious loss, whether it's a death or it's a betrayal or harsh rejection by a loved one, it's healthy to take time to sort through your feelings and move through the 5 stages of grief. Normally, this is not a time to form a new love relationship because grief is an all-consuming process and it takes time. Many people need to isolate themselves or spend time only with close friends to work through the stages of grief. Others can only reach stage 5, acceptance of the actual loss, by turning their feelings of anger, bargaining, and depression into positive action. They may set up a foundation or raise money for a cause in memory of their lost loved one, or they may step into a leadership or membership role of a social movement to help prevent future tragedies like the one they're grieving. Sometimes people who lose a love relationship because of their own out-of-control behavior can only complete the grief process by taking action to change for the better. To emerge from depression, they may need to enroll in an anger management program, AA, drug rehab, therapy, or some positive cause that allows them to prove their own goodness to themselves and others, and to forgive themselves. A great story about that is the story of the ancient Greek hero Hercules. Hercules was known as the strongest man alive, but he had a temper. One day, in a fit of anger, he murdered his wife and sons. After considering suicide, he instead decided to redeem himself through what's known as the 12 labors of Hercules, heroic deeds that saved his ancient Greek society. Different people have different ways of grieving, and individual choice should be respected. Whether you grieve through introversion or extroversion, meditation or social action, following the 5 stages of grief leads to self-healing, and that frees you up to love again. In that sense, grief doesn't exactly oppose love, it just changes the direction of your love toward yourself or toward a social cause so that you can heal yourself and recover your spirit. But when it's prolonged, grief does oppose love because it's hard to appreciate life or to express your love wholeheartedly to others when you're stuck in grief with seemingly no way out. I've already told you the story about my grandmother who, after her youngest son Eugene was killed, left my dad and my aunt feeling unloved because she was so consumed with grief. I'm sure that my grandmother loved her 2 surviving children, but she couldn't express her love to them very well or enjoy them very much because of her ongoing deep depression. Some people who experience a huge loss try not to feel the pain at all. This amounts to being stuck in denial. And it often happens to teenagers who need to grieve their feelings of being unloved by their parents so that they can continue to mature normally. These people choose not to cry or show anger. Attempting to be strong, they block the grief process by pretending they're fine. Many people, young and old, cycle around multiple stages of grief, never arriving at acceptance where inner peace resides. Beyond an inability to free themselves up to love again, love people or life wholeheartedly, they can remain trapped in grief, in the grief cycle for years. And if that isn't sad enough, they can end up acting out their stages of grief on others in harmful ways. I once worked for a small company where the president and owner was rumored to be a sexual predator, settling with accusers through arbitration. He also reportedly had raped his own daughter, who then became estranged from him. I managed to keep my head down and work hard and stay out of his way for some years, because in that job I was learning new skills that I valued. But during that time, I watched what was going on. One thing I learned about this man is that his mother had died when he was still a teenager, and the rumor was that he had never cried. Seeing how seductive he was toward female employees, and then how twisted and cold he became after he got a piece of them, along with the harassment he bestowed on women who didn't fall for his seduction, I realized this man was possibly stuck in a cycle of denial and anger. Every time he acted like he cared about a new woman but really didn't, he seemed to be symbolically denying to himself that he cared about his mother. Could he have been acting out his anger at suddenly being cut off from his mother when she died, thus cutting these women off from his love by cutting their pay or firing them? Could he have grown up being criticized and feeling rejected by his mother, acting out his anger towards her rejection by coldly rejecting her back, symbolically? Could his mother have abused him sexually when he was young? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. Not all mothers are saints. Regardless of the details of his past, though, when I watched him at the company, he appeared to be using female employees as mother figures and rejecting his mother again and again out of subliminal anger. Of course, that's all conjecture on my part. I don't think he ever even understood why he did what he did. But the game kept working for him, so he kept doing it. The one thing that was absolutely clear to me was that given his cynical attitudes about women and love and his manipulative behavior, He was incapable of giving or receiving true love, despite viewing himself as a great lover. Getting stuck in the grief process opposes the ability to experience true love. Finally, I want to mention a type of depression that's unrelated to the depression in the grief process and is not a spiritual opposite of love. Although I have less knowledge of this phenomenon, I've read about cases of people suffering from prolonged depression that's entirely physical, brought about by pesticide poisoning or undetected disease processes or heavy metals that affect the nervous system. Let me just say that moving from that kind of depression to a psychological state of acceptance is exactly the wrong thing to do. The healing process in that case involves consulting health professionals and taking whatever actions are necessary to heal and detox your body. So in this lesson, we've talked about what the word spiritual means in everyday experience and how it connects to the idea of a higher power through patriotism. We've defined two new spiritual opposites of love, certain types of cynicism, and the grief process when it's unnaturally prolonged. In lesson number 4, I'm going to return to the bright side of love and dig in to more ideas about what love is. At the end of that lesson, you'll meet another category of love's opposites, one I call shadow opposites. Between now and then, the readings and questions listed below are designed to help you integrate today's lesson and prepare you for future lessons. I hope you'll join me again next time. Bye for now.